Okay, it's time to start. Welcome all. We have a very exciting topic today for the interdisciplinary conversation between an economist and a political philosopher, Juhana Vartiainen, having a fairly sort of high position in the Finnish public sector structure. And Adrian Walsh is visiting us for a year at the Center of Excellence all the way from Australia. Let me just highlight the background of this, the origins of this session, as it were. It all goes back to a dinner with Juhana, and during that dinner we had a conversation about his sort of agenda and his difficulties, his sort of self-recognized difficulties with getting across the message that he has made so much effort to getting across to people, that something has to do with the problem that he keeps preaching about, the structural dilemma in the Finnish welfare system. And then he said, economics is not enough to getting this message across. We need political philosophy version of the same story, so that people would find it more easier to understand and accept. And I said, this sounds like an 8th session. And so here we have an economist and with these problems, and wishing to have a complementary story, maybe a supportive story from political philosophy, but we'll see how it all goes. So the background is that there are these recognized structural problems in the public economy due to certain demographic facts. There is a fairly generous pension system in all of Nordic countries, but there's an aging population, especially in Finland. There is growing longevity, shrinking participation in working life, so the dependency ratio is going up and the fiscal sustainability is going down and all that. So these are the worries. Citizens benefit from the welfare state at young and old age, and they contribute to the fiscal capacities of the welfare state in between being young and being old. And this gives rise to a need of a social contract, as it were, and this is how many economists actually themselves put it. It requires a lot of trust in society, a lot of sense of overall fairness in regard to how things are organized in society, intensive social cohesion, the feeling of being in the same boat, as it were. Now you can immediately see that these do not properly belong to the vocabulary of economics. Social contrast, trust, fairness, social cohesion, etc., etc. These rather belong to the vocabulary of political philosophy, but economists keep using these terms as well, but we will be learning more about how political philosophers would understand them. So the Nordic welfare model provides us with an array of fine public goods on the one hand, but it cannot be financed without a large labor input. People should work hard and more and all that. We know about this message. And the question is, how is this going to be ensured? How do we make it that people will actually work more for this common pool, as it were? What rights and responsibilities do citizens have, and how are they to be justified within the Nordic welfare model? So the idea indeed, as I just explained, is that the economic argument that recognizes the structural problem is in need of being supplemented with arguments from political philosophy that would be using these sorts of terms that are highlighted in bold font here. And then the interesting thing, I have no anticipation how things will go today, but the interesting question is whether there's going to be a challenge from the point of view of political philosophy, or whether Adrian is going to support this basic message that Juhana keeps telling the people. Okay. There are a number of questions. This has been also part of the public announcement of this event. that will guide the conversation. How can we save the Nordic welfare model and on what principles should it be based? How should we balance between individual economic entitlements and the requirements of the public economy? To what extent can we compel, it's a very, very strong word, compel individuals to work by using activation measures? Should public benefits be contingent upon meeting obligations with regard to, for instance, availability for work and willingness to retrain and things like that? Do the government budget constraint and the abundant supply of public goods imply that the individual's labor input is not fully owned by the individual? This is also a rather hot question. If we accept that citizens have such duties to the public economy, what correlative rights might follow from the frameworks that justify these duties? These sorts of questions, as you notice, economic terminology and terminology entertained by political philosophy appear in these questions, and now we will see how they meet one another. Juhana will start. We are very, very proud of having you here.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the invitation. Well, you outlined in very broad terms this general idea. Let me just complement with some precisions on what is my intake in this and what specific questions I'm trying to answer. Or in fact, I'm here to listen to Adrian's and even your answers in a kind of policy dilemma or philosophical dilemma that I often meet in my work. But as a kind of reservation vis-a-vis what was said by Uskali is that I have no sort of stake in this in the same sense that a decision maker or a political actor would have. I'm just an expert who talks on these issues. But still, I would say this is an issue that concerns us all. And we cannot, politics is not ruled by good arguments only. Whatever, even if we come to a nice philosophical conclusion, then the political system will perhaps deliver something else. But it is always nice, at least, to have one good argument for that makes sense both economically and ethically for such a fundamental issue as this one. So let me just outline in very briefly this basic setup. We might call it a kind of material setup, the issue at hand, and then we might try to distill some interesting philosophical questions out of this. The basic material setup is that as a result of historical path dependency, now we have in these Nordic societies a large welfare state that was in fact built or designed by in a historical phase of society where, because of demographics, the budget constraint never appeared as stringent as it does today. For that sort of original working class struggle, which resulted in all these fine public services and social insurance mechanisms, since the workforce seemed to be growing, so that each new cohort of new active people in the labor market was larger than the previous one, then it mostly was not a problem of the issue of how we are going to finance this public procurement of healthcare or childcare or pensions or whatever. That issue seldom arose, since the new cohorts of workers and ergo taxpayers would always be larger than the previous one. So that somehow by investing the means of coming generations, it seemed fairly unproblematic to establish, to design these welfare arrangements. And in the eyes of that, or these original political actors and the active working class and the trade union movement, in fact, all this seemed to be more a result of political struggle than long-term planning in terms of a long-term budget constraint, as we economists would see it. But now, with the another phase of the demographic transformation, we will, in all the Nordic countries, we will find us in a situation where it becomes much more difficult to finance these welfare state arrangements, the provision of healthcare, childcare, pensions, education, whatever is associated with the Nordic model. It becomes more difficult to finance them, and it is clear that to many economists like myself that the key to ensuring fiscal sustainability is to establish high employment rates. This Nordic model of society cannot work if we do not have a very high rate of labor market participation in these Nordic societies. And this is what we need from a kind of technocratic economist perspective. This seems almost self-evident. We can never, it is technically not possible, I believe so, it is technically not possible to raise taxes so much as to be able to procure for these public services and transfers without a high labor market participation rate. And this is where this, so that the rational collective action response to this sustainability problem. You have surely heard people talk of this sustainability gap, kestävyysvaje. The rational collective action response to the sustainability gap is to design policies that will, in some ways or in one way or another, ensure that a large share of each cohort will participate in the labor market, search for work, and then work once a job is found, etc., etc. There is not much room in this situation for not working or just consuming leisure with the help of society's basic income transfers. But this policy, as far as I can see it, and in this country, Finland in particular, this policy, when you look at the details, then it is very hotly contested politically. It is felt as politically, it is by many citizens and many organizations, many trade unions, for example, they see this as a basically politically illegitimate policy, at least a policy that seems does not have a solid enough ethical foundation. And this raises several issues of legitimacy that I find that in my view sort of are raised or pop up in various discussions around this basic policy objective. The first one is something that I have characterized in some writings of my own as the legitimacy gap, as to using economic incentives to make people work. And it seems to me that to many, especially to older generations of workers who had a fairly unproblematic or sort of in principle whose in principle relation to work is one where the value of working is not contested per se, and the old Nordic working class puts a very high esteem on working. And this implies that the very idea of using economic incentives to compel people to work seems somehow unethical, or it seems to be something that hurts people's feelings and morals. The idea that you cut the unemployment benefit and put the unemployed on some kind of training course, this seems to imply that the policymakers regard these unemployed citizens as some kind of economically optimizing machines who do not value work per se. So that in some way we all start to look like shirkers if we look at how these policies are formulated. A comparison that I have sometimes made is the following. In our families, with our sort of closest, the people that we sort of have the closest relationship with, like my wife or my son, we would not like in our own household to use high-powered economic incentives to establish some goals that we otherwise would like. I don't pay my wife for her to do some cleaning or dishes. She does not pay me for doing the grocery shopping. We don't pay our son for him to clean our room. In some way, within such a closely knit unit as the family, we like to think that we share the same goals. Nobody should be really incentivized by these economic incentives as they normally are in the market economy. But we would certainly prefer within the family to think that we shall discuss these things, we shall share our sort of common purposes and persuade each other to do the cleaning, the grocery shopping. And this is such something that strengthens our sort of wholeness as a family. And in this older working class reaction towards these activation policies, I sense a kind of similar disenchantment or similar reaction that these policies do not really respect us as ethical citizens. They just want these policies treat us as objects and treat us as economic agents, which we are not. So that would be the first issue. There is a kind of values gap as to the very idea of trying to steer, trying to influence people's behavior with economic incentives. Another has to do, and this is more practical perhaps, but these Nordic societies have established minimum economic standards, and these are very strongly guaranteed by the constitution. They are enshrined in as kind of subjective rights according to the country's political constitutions. There are minimum standards. As far as I know, they are designated. They are nominated defined in euros. There are certain minimum standard levels that society must guarantee to an individual. And this is a kind of practical obstacle for many policies that are based on making it more attractive to work. I mean, that makes it impossible to cut the social security benefit or unemployment benefit in order to make it more economically attractive to look for work. Well, this is just a fact of life. But then the Nordic labor market policy, and this is something that comes from Denmark, really. It has found a rather clever way around this. What modern activation policies do is not to steal your basic income, it is to steal your leisure. And that's how the Danish economists or some political philosophers put it quite bluntly, that because the unemployed some basic income is guaranteed, but at least it seems possible to compel the unemployed in exchange for that basic income to attend some activation courses or to take some temporary jobs, subsidized jobs in short-term jobs in some firms or whatever. So it seems to be possible not to steal your basic income that is guaranteed by the constitution, but it's somehow more legitimate to steal your leisure. And that raises the interesting issue of whether your own labor input really belongs to you. But and this is in some sense that latter question really associates to that big issue. We have established a comprehensive welfare state which kind of provides us with a package of services that starts with prenatal analysis, ultrasound pictures of the developing fetus, and it ends with the old age health services. All this, of course, imposes large costs on society. And now this really raises the issue, does your labor input belong to you? And this is, this is a politically charged and difficult issue, since we otherwise, as citizens of market economies, we like to think that we are like sovereign free agents. We buy whatever goods we want from the market, and the basic idea of the market economy is that we have the right to decide on our labor supply, on our demands and supplies of services and goods that we provide and that we buy from the market. But somehow this Nordic model seems to imply that society, in the form of the state, has a stake on your labor input. And this, well, I have no answer on this, but I guess it's I would say it's a very interesting issue, and especially if you consider it from the point of view of different groups in society. Say that you are a kind of right-wing libertarian who says, well, I have never voted for this welfare state. In fact, I would like to abolish it. And I would like to, for me, it would be perfectly acceptable to be poor, and I don't need a good healthcare insurance, say. But I want to be sort of the master of my own life. I don't want to go to any training or courses that are provided by the labor market administration. Is that okay? Then another group might be all the people who have just a short education, who do menial, unpleasant jobs. They might say, well, it's very easy for well-educated people to talk on the need on high labor market participation rates. But in fact, the reality is that we have to do very unpleasant and menial jobs, and we don't want to carry out these jobs. Is it legitimate for you to coerce, to compel us to do so? Of course, a kind of tentative answer to these issues in the vein of John Rawls would be to say, well, could we agree on something where we compensate these working poor in these menial jobs with subsidized wages, perhaps sometime simultaneously with higher taxation of people who have high salaries and well-educated people. But then you run to the problem that these well-educated people certainly have more outside options. They can go to another country, or they can just shift a part of their wage income to capital income, and it's very easy it's not very easy, but it's reasonably easy for the well-educated people to escape such arrangements. So to sum up now, I guess I would have to let Adrian talk here, but in my view, this need to ensure fiscal sustainability, in some way, it's something that we cannot really escape. We don't want to have unsustainable public finances. We want to avoid a trajectory like that of Greece. But then, if the policies necessary to ensure this seem to run to all these political and partly ethical objections, then we would like to have some good answers to these objections. And I don't see this only as a matter of persuading or convincing people of the truth that we economists have been able to able to work out. Somehow I'm quite convinced that if there is a good political or good ethical legitimation, sort of good argument for whatever policies you want to design and implement, then in the end the people will be much more prone to accept it and vote for it. But as long as we are short of good ethical arguments as to why this must be so, then this discussion is going nowhere. And certainly the sustainability problem of Finnish public finances is not going anywhere. It's still here, and the Finnish political system somehow seems unable to deliver on this issue. If you look at this latest round of budgetary discussions, then labour market participation or new policy measures that would affect labour market participation rates were conspicuously absent from those decisions. So in some way this issue is still too hot to handle, at least for the current administration. So Adrian, I hope I have given you some food for thought here.
Thank you, Juhana. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Juhana, and thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me. And this has been very interesting to think about. In one sense, it's slightly awkward for me discussing the Nordic model being Australian, but it's sort of really important general points here: political philosophy and public policy. One of the things I'll assume about the Nordic model is that it has historically been economically successful, and that it's normatively justifiable and worthy. What I'm going to do is, I've basically just used the book that was here before, the Nordic model, as my main source, and been thinking about what Juhana is going to say and has said in the past. And also, for those interested, some of what I've got to say, a broad survey of sort of political philosophy can be found in Kimlicka. I take the most important issues here. Actually, it's interesting listening to you talk there, because there's a lot more connections between what you've said and what I was about to say here than I initially realised. Right, so there's some important issues here. One is the relationship between individual interests and the public interest. Right? And in this case, it's commitment to the public economy. And secondly, the dangers. I mean, one of the things I want to do, Bustley was talking about before whether or not I was going to support or challenge. I think in a large sense there's a support for a lot of what Juhana has to say. Part of the challenge here that I want to put is how we bring about certain kinds of reforms without undermining what's good about the Nordic model. And I think that's part of what you're concerned about too. Right? So I'll say a little bit about the role of the market in that as well. Okay, I should also say, I was watching the news last night and trying to, and there was a report about pension payments covered by working populations supposedly not covering the actual pension costs, but I'm told by Juhana that that's a little bit of a beat up, but no, that's right, isn't it? It's not exactly what's going on. But anyway, the topic was exactly what we're talking about here. Right, so what do I mean by the Nordic model? Well, from the Anglo-sphere, it's often seen as a puzzle. How these economies can prosper despite weak economic incentives due to high taxation, generous social security systems, and an egalitarian distribution of income, or relatively egalitarian. So, I mean, it has often been a puzzle, I think, from those of us in the English-speaking world. And for many people, I suppose on the left of politics, in somewhere like Australia, it's been a model that people look towards as something to aspire towards. The Nordic model here, as far as the report goes, embraces both globalisation and the welfare state, and the argument is that security offered by collective mechanisms for sharing risk has been instrumental in enhancing a favourable attitude to globalisation and competition. So supposedly the virtue of the Nordic model is its ability to reconcile risks and uncertainties with openness and a market economy. Right, so one of the things you might ask about here is what are some of the philosophical underpinnings of it? Somebody might be, I've got a couple of things. You might actually think part of what's going on here is an egalitarianism. In the report itself, it talks a lot about egalitarianism, all right, and egalitarian. Sometimes the spirit of it seems to be social democratic, or, well, I don't know if it's a social democrat, but going back to Marx, and the famous saying that from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. You might try to justify or see what's going on with the Nordic model in terms of utilitarianism, given the emphasis on the increase in social resources. But I actually think much of what's going on here is really prioritarian. Right? So Rawls famously, Rawls doesn't talk about prioritarianism, but he gives an account of distributive justice. One of his principles is the difference principle, which, I've got a rather complicated version of it up there, which is what's in a theory of justice. But the idea is roughly to make the worst off better off. Now, contemporary political philosophers don't call that egalitarian, they call it prioritarian. And I think there's a lot of prioritarianism. Well, I mean, what's underpinning a lot of the ideals in that book and the understanding generally of the Nordic model is prioritarian. I mean, this is in a sense controversial. I mean, but certainly I think the Nordic model's combination of market-oriented reforms combined with the provision of universal welfare does make it seem rather more prioritarian rather than straightforwardly egalitarian. What I want to do is just, as a matter of contrast, and I suppose it says something about what's going on where I come from. I want to contrast it with a model, what I'm going to call, and other people have called, virtue parsimony. Right? And I'll just say a little bit about that in a minute. But why I do this is because I think it's the other end of the spectrum. And this is the idea that our models should rely on as little what's called virtue or social commitment as possible. Right? So one of the things about the Nordic model as it's presented and as it's been understood is that it relies on social commitment on part of the general population to the goals of society, to the public economy. And in a way you were talking about that before, about the danger of certain kinds of market incentives not only being demeaning, but I think also undermining people's social commitment. So the model I'm calling virtue parsimony, and you can find descriptions of this amongst economists like Geoffrey Brennan and amongst Albert Hirschman, who some of you might know from some of his historical writings, talks about parsimony. Right? Now this is one, as I say, it's a different model of the relationship of the citizens of a nation to the goals of society, if you want to put it that way. And this is a principle of institutional design, that if we're faced with a choice between two or more forms of institutional design, not all other things being equal, we should prefer the one that requires less virtue input from its citizens to the one that requires more. Before, when Juhana was talking about what people find demeaning about sometimes the use of the market and economic incentives, it's related to this in the sense that, I mean, not only do people find it demeaning, many people might find it demeaning, but it's the idea that we can't expect anything more from people than, the less we rely on social commitment, the less we rely on virtue understood as a commitment to the social whole, a commitment to the public economy, the better off we are. Now clearly something like the Nordic model hasn't functioned like that. So when people say and are concerned about certain kinds of social reforms that are going on that involve the market, much of it I think is not just that it's demeaning, but also that it has a model of institutional design based on virtue parsimony. And I think, as I say, this can be seen as a possible response to the problem in political philosophy of how we balance the relationship between individual virtue and our political institutions. And in general, is it a good idea to prefer those institutions that demand anticipating individuals' good intentions, that is a virtue-rich input? Or alternatively, in the interest of human flourishing, should we prefer those institutions that are thrifty or parsimonious with respect to the virtue inputs demanded of those who inhabit them, even to demand no virtue inputs at all? Right, so it's not, the question's fairly fundamental, because this is something that hasn't been part of political thinking up here. So the principle is usually accompanied by two glosses. The primary reason for employing this principle is that virtue is scarce, and if virtue is scarce, the less we rely on good intentions, then the more likely we are to succeed. And all that I mean by virtue here, I mean, I'm not invoking some kind of virtue ethics, I'm just meaning commitment to the social, to the public good. Now, all right, so this is background. I'll come back to this idea about virtue parsimony in a little while, but the challenge for the Nordic model, will there be, I left that there when I was putting this together, will there be sufficient workers to cover the cost of those receiving social welfare and related government services? And it raises questions about the obligations of the individual to the public economy. I mean, that's already been said by both Huskilly and Juhana. All right. Now, two possible responses to this. I'm going to call it retirement deferral. I mean, it's probably an economic term. And activation measures, retraining. So, two of the policies that have been put forward are these two. I should say that the latter is probably in some ways more socially controversial because if you think about the distinction between omission and commission, I mean, one thing, the retirement deferral just relies that it's much more a policy of omission in the sense that you just omit or people can't get a pension and whatever until much later. Whereas activation measures involve commitment or commission in the sense that it requires, may well require some form of coercion. And for that reason, they're at least politically more controversial. They may well be morally very little difference in terms of what they expect of people in terms of their commitment to the public economy, but certainly forcing people to do something is much more difficult than withdrawing something from them. Right, okay, now as it says in the report, this is the report that Juhana was one of the co-authors of. We're emphasised at a high rate of labour, you can read that, I won't read all that. But basically the point is that lengthening working careers must go hand in hand with increasing longevity. So that's what's being put forward. Okay. As I say, any such retirement deferral is obviously controversial since it places pressure on one of the elements that many see as central to the Nordic model, namely a safe and financially secure retirement that begins in one's 60s. All right, now, I'll just go back. It raises general questions about the obligations of the individual citizens to the public economy, and all right. One of the interesting things about this, though, is it does require the actual retirement deferral and getting people to agree to it and legitimating it across society as a whole. It does require some commitment on the part of members of society to those common goals. For forcing it without commitment will undermine some central features of the Nordic model, namely individuals' commitment to the social whole. Should also notice, in a sense, that these retirement deferrals and expecting people to accept it on the grounds of the good of the public economy, in many ways is at odds with or is 180 degrees from the ideals underneath virtue parsimony, which suggests that people are, virtue is rather scarce. Right, now I've just got two assumptions that, I'm not an economist, I don't actually know much about the demographics of the Nordic countries or Finland or whatever. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to accept that that's the case, and I think there's good reasons for accepting it. One is, the two assumptions, first is the retirement assumption. Economic circumstances are such that we do need help we do need to increase the retirement age. Right, let's just say that's true. Now, you might have some empirical arguments to say that's false, but I think for the point of view of this is that's an assumption. Right? And as a matter of fact, I'd be loath to challenge it anyway, given it seems highly plausible given the demographics. I should say, just personally, I don't have a problem with the retirement age for myself being extended, but the sort of work I do is such that I mean, you know, it's not physically demanding being a philosopher, and so on. But many people, I mean, I think it could be it's dangerous to start generalising from your own circumstance, obviously. And I think that it's not true for many people who have jobs that are very physically demanding, dangerous, mind-numbingly boring, or stressful. So David Miller, I mean, I was reminded when you were talking, years and years ago in a book called Social Justice, talks about dirty, dangerous work. And he talks about compensating. That seems, people for that, I mean, that seems to have fallen off the political agenda a lot in the last 20 years. But it is something I think you've raised that's worth talking about in this context, because it's very different raising the retirement age for somebody who's working a particularly stressful or dangerous job than it is for people in work like, say, highly engaging or and the assumption of harm, I'll assume that extending the time before one can retire is a harm or a bad-making feature of a state of affairs. All right. So that's the other assumption, that this is a harm. I mean, a couple of mitigating factors about the harm. One is that we are living longer and we are fitter to an older age, so the extent to which working longer is a harm is probably less than it might once have been, 100 years ago. The other thing is that the other harm mitigation point I want to make is that those working in stressful, physically demanding work could be reallocated, reassigned to work that's less harmful in those respects. All right, so some of the problems we have, and this is just a reiteration of some things that were said by Leslie earlier. How do we justify the imposition of this harm? On what philosophical grounds might one object? Can we object within a social democratic framework? Do we need to provide another conceptual normative framework in order to justify the imposition of this burden? All right. Well, one, and it was mentioned before, that the ownership objection. How am I going for time? What time have I got? It'll be fine. Yeah, okay. All right. One objection that Juhana raised before was what I'll call the ownership objection. And that's the idea, is to reframe the problem in terms of the ownership of labour. Now you can imagine a number of different objections. You can imagine a liberal objection to social expectations of contribution and the social coercion involved in a social democratic project. You can imagine certain kinds of social subjections because you might think from a socialist point of view that increasing the period of work involves increasing the period of exploitation and oppression. And you can imagine utilitarian objections, all right? I mean, they would be empirical in nature, and the idea would be that somehow that this retirement, increasing the retirement age, somehow has bad consequences for the economy as a whole, or the overall sum of utility. But, I mean, I think the utilitarian arguments seem to be going the other way, and I think that's partly what was being said before. Right, so one way of conceptualising what has been proposed is to think of it as a call upon our labour that we already own. And all right, so you might think of this as morally illegitimate because it involves requisitioning labour that we own, and why does the government have a right to obtain or requisition that labour? So that's an objection that was raised just before. But here's some questions about, is ownership of labour the best way to understand the issue? If ownership is an appropriate way to understand it, then does that mean that requisitioning by government of some of the labour is illegitimate? To what extent is opting out a possibility? And if citizens have these responsibilities, then what rights follow? So, I mean, I'm going to weave these questions through the rest of this discussion. The first question here, is ownership of labour the best way to understand the issue? I don't actually think it is, but I'll come back to the end. And there's a question about the extent to which we own our labour. But I will come back to it. So I'll look at the second question. If ownership is an appropriate way to understand the problem, then does that mean requisition by government of some of the labour is legitimate? Well, it sort of reminds me of questions about taxation. I mean, we're talking about labour here, but similar arguments go on about taxation of property and people's work. And you find the discussion of, this idea expressed by Milton Friedman in the book Free to Choose, Milton and Rose Friedman. They talk about Tax Freedom Day, and that people should celebrate Tax Freedom Day. And this is the day for Americans when they stop working for government through their tax payments and start working for themselves. Right? So Tax Freedom Day is calculated by taking total federal, state and local taxes and dividing national income to get a ratio representing the share of income the average person pays on all taxes. And it's applied to a 365-day calendar. And so apparently for this year, according to the Tax Freedom website, April the 17th is Tax Freedom Day, so it's for Americans, so it's 2 days ahead. All right, so if anyone's American here, you have to put on your red, white and blue socks or something. All right. We find a similar, I mean, okay, that's Friedman's idea. You find similar kinds of ideas in Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia, where he talks about self-ownership. And for those of you who've studied political philosophy, I won't go into it in great detail. And for those of you who haven't come across Nozick's work, I can just briefly say that he begins with the thought that we own our own bodies, and by mixing our labour with objects in the world, we come to own them. And what is fundamental to Nozick's system is the idea that we own our labour, and the government requisitioning of this necessarily involves unjustifiable, it's theft in a sense, and involves unjustifiable coercion. So you could see how somebody would develop an objection to the kinds of retirement proposals that Juhana's talking about in terms of Nozick's views. Oddly or interestingly, you get related views from Marxists, or some Marxists. The analytic Marxist Jerry Cohen, in a book called Self-Ownership, Freedom and Equality, argues that, he's not talking about retirement, but he does talk about self-ownership, and he thinks the best way to explicate Marx's claims about the exploitation of the working class is in terms of self-ownership. We can talk about that later if anybody wants to talk about it. But interesting, you can see how you might get an objection to this kind of proposal from the right, but you could also get one from the left, where people are talking about how self-ownership of workers means that the requisition of labour by governments and capitalists is such that any extension of the period of time when people work is morally legitimate. I think there are problems with talking in these ways. So the first, just to go back to the notion of ownership, and I won't go into this in great detail, but Tony Honore, article called Ownership, it was published in 1961, notes that ownership he sort of questions the assumption that ownership is a single right to the exclusive use and control of an object. Actually, interestingly, I discovered, I think, looks like Tony Honore is still alive. I don't know if anyone looking on the website, so, and still writing, so that's impressive, given how long he's been doing interesting work in this area. But his idea is that ownership is a bundle of rights, and it's a little bit like you don't have to have all the rights in order to have ownership, or you don't have to. At any one point, you don't have to have all the bundle of rights in order for it to be a form of ownership. Now, the point for our purposes is that ownership of one's labour does not mean that such ownership comes without social obligations, as I think the objection from ownership might seem to suggest. So the earlier, I put it rather bluntly and quickly, but there is a sense in that in the sense of the objection of ownership, that you own your ownership of anything, whether it's your own labour or property, always gives you exclusive rights to it, and that no social obligations come with it. The second, so that's one difficulty. A second difficulty has to do with the rather odd causal account, according to which ownership rights can exist prior to the provision of institutional, prior to the existence of governmental institutions that provide the framework in which rights are able to be exercised. So, this interesting book Liam Murphy and Thomas Nagel wrote in 2004 called The Myth of Ownership, Taxation and Justice. And there they attack those who regard taxation as a governmental violation of pre-existing, pre-institutional property rights. According to Murphy and Nagel, our incomes are earned in a world with government, which is necessarily a world that has already had taxes in it. without the legal and economic institutions supported by taxes that make a market economy possible, would have nothing, or at any rate nothing resembling what we have now. So they're saying, as the quote there says, what we have is not ours in any meaningful or, more importantly, justifiable sense. Instead, the distribution of property income is directly related to a host of government policies. The proper way to approach the analysis of tax policy, therefore, is to view it in the context of the general aims of government, underlined as they are by the basic philosophical arguments about the type of society in which we want to live. Basically, saying there isn't, it's not the model that they're trying to attack is this idea that I own something, I own my labour, and then the government comes in and suddenly taxes it. Right? It's like we're out in the bush, or whatever you call it here in Finland, whatever you call it, the bush. And I'm working away, and the government comes in like some marauding bush ranger and takes or imposes tax or something. Their point is that you don't have anything in that sense without the government framework, and that framework is predicated upon the prior existence of taxes. Right, there's a further point you might wish to make here, and this is that the skills and capacities that we have in performing work are not something we have independently of society itself. This is not a point about the institutional framework, but the origins of the powers that we have, all right, that this ideal of strong ownership seems to ignore. All right, so just think about the dialectic of this so far. A little bit, okay. Well, I'll hurry up. Okay, good. All I'm saying here is this objection doesn't hold much water. But does it justify? Just one other thing, we talked about opting out. I mean, we can come back to this later, but I think in a sense, opting out of this particular retirement deferral it looks rather like free riding. We can talk about that again later. I think one of the things is to try to justifying, okay, what I've done there is just to criticise an objection, but how do you go about actually justifying these kinds of policies? Well, one way might be utilitarian justification, right? And I'm suggesting you can justify it within a social democratic framework. I'm told, and because I don't read the debates here, a lot of them I can't read, I'm told that there's a lot of hostility towards a lot of what Juhana's saying. So part of what I think is interesting here is to see how you might justify it within the social democratic framework. Right, so you could justify this with the utilitarian framework, but I don't want to do that. But what I want to do is just look at a distributive route. And I think we need to treat a longer working life as one of the burdens that now need to be dealt with when making decisions about the, so I should say proper, not ROPA, allocation of distributed benefits and burdens. I think some of the audience will no doubt know that it's a tradition beginning with Aristotle of seeing distributive justice as covering the allocation of benefits and burdens. So instead of regarding it just as a harm, when I talked about it before, I was saying that retirement, extending the retirement age should be thought of as a harm. I think we need to think of it as a distributive burden that needs to be accommodated within practices that are compatible with the practices and ideals of social democracy. So no longer it's not so much a matter of justifying or objecting to this proposal, if the demographic information is right, but rather seeing it as part of an unavoidable background, as part of the unavoidable background, if you want to put it that way, of public policy making. So what does it mean to think about it as a distributed burden? Well, I think it carries with it the idea of it being an unavoidable feature of social life, for which all members of society are responsible. The question then is, okay, let's accept it's a distributed burden, it's background consideration in the decision making. How do we bring about policies in relationship to that are compatible with the ideals of social democracy and don't undermine it? I think that, and that's partly what you were pushing at before. I've just got a list here of what this is the report. There should be apostrophe there. Forgive me. There's three recommendations I think are interesting here, and this is where a lot of the debate about public policy is. The changing demographics underline the need to reduce benefit dependency and raise employment rates. Okay. The appendix spending pushes call for actions that define the core activities of the welfare state, set limits for what the government is responsible for, and enhance the efficiency of public services. And third thing there is the importance of investment in human capital in the young. So I think those are what that particular report's oriented towards. I've got some suggestions here, I think, which are basically just oriented, so I'll finish with this, and hopefully I'll have got, so we'll take 2 or 3 minutes. I think the trick is, if we think of it as a distributed burden, we are going to have to deal with, I mean, it's true of most Western countries that there's an increase, we've got this demographic change that means that the base of people who create the wealth is diminishing. And if we want to maintain, a decent welfare system and a decent system of education for the future, then how do we go about financing it? And how do we do that in a way that's compatible with the kinds of ideals that people think are really important and are part of a social democracy? Well, I think the first one is, as I've already said, reconceptualise retirement deferral as a distributed burden. Right? It's not about justifying or objecting to it. It's a matter of seeing that as a background feature of public policy. I think also it needs to be accepted that it's a group responsibility which should be dealt with in line with the ideals of social democracy. So, and part of that, I mean, what that means is, if the burden can be made less burdensome through efficiency methods, then that is prima facie desirable. But those methods should not undermine the sense of commitment to the common good across the society, nor undermine measures that ensure all take responsibility for it. So I think it's important that everyone takes responsibility for these measures. More specifically, in adopting efficiency measures, which typically involve market solutions, these should not be promoted on the virtue parsimonious grounds that a system which relies on less virtue is preferable to one which relies on more, since this would undermine the commitment that is part of the success of the Nordic model and for most social democratic countries. So I think the point, and this does connect up with what Juhana was saying, it's not just that using markets can be seen as demeaning or economic incentives as demeaning, but it's also the consequence of that might be that people's commitment to the public economy can be undermined. And so part of what we need to do is to ensure that it's not a Trojan horse, that the use of market-based solutions isn't a Trojan horse for the endorsement of a framework that praises being parsimonious about concern for the common good. I think we should be, finally, fourth, so I'm nearly finished, we should avoid regarding the profit motive as a singular motive. Now, why do I say that? Well, all right, so the point before was about virtue parsimony, and it was about let's not allow the focus on market-based solutions to undermine the commitment to the public good. I think one point to be made about that also is that sometimes people have the Kantian thought that market norms and valuing something intrinsically are necessarily mutually exclusive. And I think in part we need to recognise there are cases where they're compossible. The danger is where markets corrode intrinsic value. And the fourth point here is avoid regarding the profit motive as a singular motive. And what I mean by this is that people talk about the profit motive, but in fact it's a range of motives. And sometimes people can pursue there's different versions of the profit motive. Some of them involve singularly pursuing money, and others have side constraints. Right? So one way you might think is moral side constraints. So people can pursue profit with moral side constraints. So I think it's important to be aware that those, when we bring in these market mechanisms, that those pursuing profit are encouraged to have and see the importance of those profit motives being side constrained by commitment to the common good and by commitment to the welfare of others. And final point is just citizens' responsibilities and rights, and again there should be an apostrophe there. And I think just similarly, a lot of this focus is being put on to, a lot of the stress or the onus here is being put on to ordinary workers, and I think that it needs to be seen as a responsibility that's taken up by the society as a whole. One of the reasons that it's been successful, the Nordic model, is because it has been a compact between both business and the unions and other representatives of working people, and if that was undermined, I think it would be a bad thing. But a lot of the pressure here needs to both, pressure needs to be not only on citizens but also on business as well. Right, so I might just leave that there. Thanks.
Thank you, Adrian. That was a rich array of new terminology
Can you put the last slide?
Yeah.
So we find
Even suggestions. So, Juhana, I wonder how you would put your own thoughts on this matter.
Well, yes, let me react, thank you. Let me react to something that you said. At times during the course of your argument, I felt at times a bit lost, but then this last slide, in fact, my view is that this gets us forward. Since your sort of material analysis of the situation does not really challenge my basic dilemma, but what you seem to suggest in this is that do not rely on this idea that is very sort of dear to economists, that we really start from zero virtue inputs. That's what we do in our economic models. We assume that these economic agents will start to maximize their own leisure and income, and they don't have any commitment to society at all. And then this analysis leads us to policy recommendations that mostly rely indeed on the profit motive, right? So that what we say is that, well, if the labor input is not large enough to sustain the welfare state, then we must cut unemployment benefits and cut taxes on labor income, and by these means working becoming more attractive, then the labor input will increase. And what you suggest, in fact, is something that in fact I find extremely convincing, is that the good politician here should not talk speak so much about economic incentives, but community values, virtues, responsibilities of the citizen, etc. And in some way, when you put this list up there, then I would say this reminds me of what goes on in Sweden. I mean, even and Sweden does not have a sustainability problem, and even the right-wing bourgeois Minister of Finance, Anders Borg, who I must confess I feel much I'm a sort of secret admirer of his. But this is more or less what he says. He does not talk so much about economic incentives, but he talks about this our common society based on Nordic values and Lutheran values of working. And my values, that's something that he said, my values do not differ from those of the Social Democrats, but the difference is that I take this work ethic and work idea seriously, whereas they mostly speak about subsidies and transfers. And somehow that seems to work to some extent in Sweden, in my view, so that this appeal to the virtue and the work ethic does a lot of the job that we economists would assume should be done by economic incentives. But in fact, there is a deficit on virtue in many of these issues. So I think this last slide really takes us forward. But the problem with our country, Finland, is that the political talk about these issues and the way politicians address these issues do not really appeal to this to a large enough degree. I guess there's more talk in this country, more talk of how we all are victimized by the global economy and market forces and our jobs that move to China, or how the work life is much too stressful and takes a tear and toll on individual workers, and we cannot work until the retirement age. There's much less talk in this country of the common virtue of working and sustaining our welfare arrangements. And I can now, when my reflection on what you said is the sort of the deep reflection is the following. I guess that when we economists, we put the profit motive first, and we mostly talk about economic incentives, that may in fact alienate some people, some workers who don't like to be addressed as profit seekers or economic maximizers according to what we economists think of them. And there is a very nice paper, in fact, on this that might be used in this argument in an indirect way. It's by a brilliant Norwegian economist who's professor at the Stockholm School of Economics. Tore Ellingsen is his name. And he has a couple of years back, he has a very nice paper on when economic incentives can become counterproductive. So it's a very sort of standard economic setup where there is a principal and an agent. And the principal sets economic incentives for the agent in order to make him carry out some tasks. And then he builds a sort of philosophical argument where, in the case where the economic incentives are very sharp, then the agent starts to think that the principal is only a profit-driven, unethical person, and then he doesn't really want to work at all, or do precisely what the principal would like him to do. And to put, I guess many of in the audience here are not familiar with these principal-agent models, but I might, if I would put this in more intuitive terms, if I again refer to this example of how things work in the family. Let's say in our family, we have persuaded our son to do some grocery every day for us. Let's say he buys 2 liters of milk. We drink a lot of milk, so he buys 2 liters of milk every day. And then, well, we get older, and someday I will tell to him that, well, we would now like you to, this is completely imaginary of course, we would like you to buy not only milk but even bread and vegetables. And then he would say, well, I have a life of my own, you know, I would like to play my guitar and see my friends and see my girlfriend. I don't really want to put up this or that labor input for this family. And then if I would say, like an economist, well, so far I have not paid you anything for buying these groceries. What if I now pay you 10 euros and you buy some more, you buy even the vegetables and the bread? And then his reaction might be, well, now I see that you seem to insult me by suggesting that I have been doing this, I would be doing this for economic incentives. In fact, of course, I've been buying the milk because I love you as my parents. But the fact that you put such an economic incentive on me, that means that you don't really appreciate me as a sort of whole human being. And perhaps I might now buy some vegetables and bread for you, but now I want you to pay 50 euros for me, since I will now, from now on, look at this as a purely economic transaction. This is more or less the Ellingsen argument put in more intuitive terms. You understand the basic setup. And this is perhaps at least a kind of intermediate answer, that we should really put this problem in terms of moral, social commitments, group responsibilities. We should not promote these policies on virtue parsimonious grounds, and we should not regard the profit motive as a singular motive. Instead, we should speak about responsibilities and rights. But then, of course, you have the harsh real world. When you want really to deal with this, you should get the politicians talk about this, and not only about economic incentives. And then there's the very harsh economic reality that in order to design sustainable public finances, we need anyway a large inflow of immigrants. And it might be the case for many immigrant groups, for example, that when they come in the country, they do not really share all these age-old values, perhaps, and so, I mean, many Danish social scientists say that it was in fact the immigrants that really compelled the authorities to design these more profit-oriented labor market policies. This is not, I'm not saying that immigrants in some ways are lazy or whatever, but they certainly, a newcomer in a country does not immediately share the same ethical heritage and common ground in that sense. And so we will have heterogeneous groups reacting on these incentives. You might say the suspicion of many older workers is that the young do not really share their work ethic either. They just take whatever transfers there are to take, and they don't feel the same group responsibilities as the older generations do. And then you have immigrants. So it's a sort of heterogeneous group of preferences that you are addressing people with these policies. But basically, I think this is a very nice intermediate answer, at least. So that would be my reaction to what Adrian said.
Yeah, thank you. Sounds like a striking agreement is emerging. By the way, of course, in economics there are new initiatives that introduce exactly these sorts of ideas, considerations of moral emotions, fairness, trust, group identity, and all that. But I think Finnish economics and also Swedish economics are weak on this. So I mean, maybe the Nordic countries require different kind of academic economics in the near future before it's too late. But let's open the floor for you. Sure, you have questions, reactions, queries. We have Aki and then Mariam.
Well, I was thinking for a long time that we talk about this fiscal sustainability issue, and I was thinking if there are differences between Finland and Sweden, for example, with respect to this issue. There's two causes. One is that they have taken in much more immigrants, and the second is, of course, the wartime differences that we have the big generations retiring now. But my intuition has been all the time, why couldn't it solve the problem just by increasing the immigration?
You want me to?
Yeah, that's good.
If I start, well, technically, sort of from the point of view of technocratic economics, that would I mean, designing a somewhat selfish immigration policy in the sort of as a country like Canada does, taking an influx of immigrants with such a composition that the overall rate of employment will just be large enough that would solve the problem. But this is part of this political dilemma, that this solution seems to be rejected by the political system, and there is a very concrete, sharp difference in this respect between Sweden and Finland, in as much as Finland still operates a selective immigration policy where the recruitment of when firms recruit from outside the European community, then this will be subject to an assessment of whether there is a shortage of labor in that sector. And very often this is a longish bureaucratic procedure that results in less immigration. So, and in many ways, the decision makers reject this solution. The knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, we must first give jobs to our own unemployed, and then we will start importing people. But then, as economists, we know that this will never happen, since the very fact that we have a shrinking labor force does not per se affect the structural rate of unemployment. So we might never come in that phase where we have given jobs to our own unemployed and then start increasing immigration. But basically the answer is yes. You only have to convince the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance on that.
Mary.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts. One was within the framework of your solution, well, actually more of what Adrian was discussing in terms of pensions, of whether what what you think of a proposal of, this was just inspired when you were talking about distributive burdens. So about pensions being more individualized in comparison to how much input you've actually put into the labor force. So depending on how early you start employment. In this case, academics are tough luck because it takes such a long time for us to get out into the labor market. But as you were pointing out, a lot of us don't mind working later, whereas people that don't engage in higher education might be cut slack and get be allowed to have pensions earlier, and that would be a kind of good way of incentivizing work as well as minimizing the felt burden.
Okay, it's your suggestion that those who are working more menial work have an earlier
So it's
time
not
age.
really determined about the content of your work
Yeah.
as much as how long you actually participate in the labor market.
I think, okay, Jim, I think you can have differential, depending on what it means, but it's not, I'd be pretty wary of punishing, I suppose I'm a little bit wary about us in a privileged situation punishing those who come from less privileged backgrounds, but it just depends what it meant. But yeah, I don't have a problem with it at all. If you could have differential retirement ages, that's what you're suggesting. Yeah, okay, yeah, I don't know.
But that's certainly an issue on the table. But then it also endangers it implies a kind of sunk cost in as much as if you impose a sort of amount of years worked as a condition for retirement, then some people who might still want to go on working just will retire earlier than they would otherwise do. If you start working at 20 and you have put the limit at 60, then the person at 40 years of career, then the person retires at 60, even if we by other means could have convinced him or her to work until 68 and contribute to the public purse. So this is certainly, it's an issue on the table, but it entails some costs, some inefficiency as well.
So can I just ask the other thing was another solution, kind of outside your framework of discussion, like ACTI, but it was different. Also, I was thinking there was very little talk about sort of why there's a problem now with the Nordic model, why it's only intention. It strikes me that one of the problems is global competition and businesses demanding, stakeholders of businesses, owners of business demanding, very easily saying we're moving abroad or demanding more profit margins. So in terms of getting more people into work, it should also be about job creation, not just incentivizing work, because it seems like, to me, not the work ethic isn't the main problem. The problem is there's more to do with, diminishing types of opportunity on a national basis for at least some types of work. So I was kind of surprised that you didn't address that.
Well, that's really an issue on the material side. What's your analysis of the economy? And economists certainly disagree on that. I completely disagree with that description, since we are a part of a global capital market, so that in my analysis the employment rate in the long run is completely determined by labor supply. But this is, some economists would agree with you, I guess. Still, I would guess the majority would agree with me.
There's an argument for it.
What about you, Adrian?
I don't know about the empirical side of it. Part of the point I was making at the end there is that the pressure shouldn't just be on the working on business as well. So I suppose part of, and I don't know how that translates into the empirical considerations you've got here. I don't actually know what the causes are. Insofar as, in that report, it actually talks about globalisation that you wrote as one of the causes, not just a demographic. So, I think that is part of the story, obviously. But I do think that the pressure one thing that worries me about a lot of these sorts of projects is that excessive focus is on the commitment of the workers and not enough perhaps on the businesses. Is that what you're suggesting? Yeah, well, that was in a sense what I was saying at the end there too. I'm not going to disagree with Juhana about the empirical matter.
No, business has no, what was Marx? What's this in English? Business has no fatherland or whatever. It's just an amorphous, globalized capital. They don't have any commitments towards whichever particular country, and they will never have. So I think that's just empty talk.
Yeah, thanks. This is a follow-up to Aki's point, and then another question to your, just a follow-up comment on the, if there's a good economic argument for raising the level of immigration significantly, I think it's the role of those experts who don't have a stake in the political party, who don't have to be elected, that they should make a lot of noise about that, especially in the current opinion climate in Finland. So I think that's, we should put that back on the agenda. I think that it was on the agenda earlier, but recent political turns that have sort of taken it quietly away from the agenda. So just a comment. Then on the suggestion on, I think that this kind of move that you appeal to the sense of responsibility, I think that goes well with the kind of Nordic welfare model idea. But I think that what it, as it's sort of the other side of the coin, is that then it presupposes that people feel that their kind of sense of fairness or the sense of justice in how the cuts are being made or how the burdens are being reallocated, that works. So that if there's a growing sense of injustice, and then there's also growing allocation of burdens, then it doesn't work. So it seems that as often is the key to keep the kind of sense of solidarity going. That the perception of justice, and it might be that because if the system is already brilliant and then it's sort of deteriorating a little, it might lead to a growing sense of injustice, even though sort of it's a brilliant just system still. So it's this kind of.
This is just anecdotal, but from my reading of it, what's gone on in Greece is that people believe the whole system is corrupt. Just average people, everyone else is ripping off. Government's ripping money off, big business is ripping money off. Why shouldn't I? And it's what you're talking about. There's a growing sense of injustice, and then kind of commitment to the social whole disappears. And I think that's the kind of concern you have, isn't it? So part of the story has to be that there's a perception that the way that if there's a burden, that it is being shared in a fair way, even if it's not equally, but nonetheless that the burden that is there is being shared in a way that people regard as just. So I agree with you, and that's kind of part of what I was alluding to. So.
I guess this is an issue that these Nordic governments in some way are aware of. And an example of that is the fact that there is in place, even in Sweden, a higher tax bracket for those who earn a very high monthly income, over 60,000 crowns or something like that. That was established in the late 90s, if I remember. It's called Värnskatten, a kind of tax for the rich. And the econometrics tell us that this does not really bring in revenue. I mean, the high income people are able to transfer that income into capital income or whatever. But the Swedish government still does not want to abolish that tax, I guess, and that's precisely because of what you say. They want to give all these signals of fairness at the same time when they impose a sort of fairly harsh labor market supply boosting policy. But I completely agree, and perhaps the problem with the dilemma of these 2010s years is that there are so many phenomena that all push into a sort of less unequal, less equitable distribution. Many of these technological innovations, for example, they tend to increase low-paying jobs and high-paying jobs, and many people see the entire system moving into a more unfair direction. And then, of course, there will be opposition towards activating labor market policy as well.
Can I just say something following on from that? Because it's interesting. What you're picking up there is the expressive function of some of these, measures. So the measure in Sweden that you're talking about clearly has an expressive function. There was a guy called Bernard de Juvenal in I think it was in the 50s, wrote a book on justice, and he's a very right-wing economist. He was saying, look, if you tax and redistribute from the top, it has very little overall benefit. But of course, and it's presumably that's what you're saying here, but sometimes it has an expressive function in terms of maintaining a sense of justice across society that then maintains a social commitment, which in the long run presumably has utilitarian benefits.
Let me just, as a side remark, remind you of our preparatory conversations when we tried to find a focus for this discussion. Juhana insisted on this structural problem, and you said it's completely independent of the current crisis. And I suggested that maybe it is, but the solution of the structural problem is not independent of the current crisis, especially how the current crisis is being treated. If there is this feeling and sense of unfairness, injustice, etc., the way that the European debt crisis is being dealt with in favor of big banks, using our taxpayers' money and all that, the increasing income differences and all that. If there is this growing sense of injustice in society, then it's going to be a big problem for solving the structural problem. And therefore, you need to, politicians should take good care of the moral sentiments in society at large.
And that's a nice point.
Okay, we have Lisa.
Yes, I'm sorry that we came a bit late and I missed the first part, but the distributive burden, if I understood, is mostly financial issue. But what about environmental aspects? Because all paid jobs are not environmentally useful or beneficial, and the new discussion on welfare states and the futures of the welfare states are also looking at the issue of environmental costs of different kind of work.
Yeah, well, I suppose it just adds another complication to it, doesn't it? I mean, we're treating it here without thinking about them. I mean, look, the questions as they're phrased here don't take into account environmental considerations. Clearly, those need to be taken into account, but whether they make any difference in terms of the way that we distribute goods amongst ourselves is another matter. I mean, they might well mean that that there's less. I mean, we have to cut back certain ways we produce goods, but I don't know whether it makes any difference within the distributive questions, within a society. I mean, it may well be change the way that we do create wealth. Does that make sense? Yep, maybe. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Well, yeah, in my view, it opens up one more layer of sort of dilemmas with the vis-a-vis the economic model and the virtue parsimonious model. Here, the main externality is the labor input. It's for purely economic agents in the Nordic society. It is attractive to work quite a little since our leisure is subsidized by the welfare state. And then our preliminary conclusion at least seems to be that we must appeal to group responsibility and not virtue parsimoniousness. But then this environmental issue just replicates a kind of similar issue on the global level. And this is far too grandiose for me. I don't know anything about it. That are other issues.
Yes, since we are in the interdisciplinary approach now, I'd like to elaborate this a little, because we were talking all the time as if there existed only economics on the other hand and philosophy on the other hand, whereas the questions of welfare have usually been addressed within the disciplines of social policy, which deal with or explain the social policy or the welfare system, usually based on agencies, interest, power, and so forth. And they don't figure in your argumentation by any means. This is my first question. The second question concerns the sociology or the understanding of labor, how you understand the working life, because if you take the working life in terms of the sociology of work, you always find there as well, not only let's say, equal relations, but high level inequality. When you were saying, Andrew, that you would be willing to work as we all would like to, it's not a problem for us to work until 68 or whatever, because we like it. It's not organized, it's not heteronomic in that sense. But for most of the people, this is the problem, and this is the problem for the Social Democrats in political terms, because they represent people who do not have this kind of position in the working class. How do you address this issue?
But the second question, I did assume it was, my point was not to generalise from my own experience, but more to recognise that it was a harm. So the assumption was that this is a burden, and then, that's how I addressed it, in a sense. First question is about, I don't know, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, I might just, on the second issue. Well, of course, there is gross inequality in the labor market, and some people have menial jobs and some have very satisfying jobs. But my question to you is, well, we have this practical problem with the fiscal sustainability. How would you address this work-life inequality? I just can't see any easy solutions. I am still fairly convinced that this economic openness and participation with the global economy and using the global division of labor, this gives us on average the sort of a high living standard. And I'm quite sort of honest and candid in admitting that I don't have any sort of solution to that basic problem, short of the in excess of what social democracy traditionally has promised. Tax in some of the incomes and then try to publicly provide some goods that enhance the quality of life for everybody. But short of a kind of social revolution, I don't know how you should address this. How would you address that? I guess it was tried in 1918, but it did not turn out that well either.
Quick summary of this.
In social democratic tradition, which you know as well as I do, there has been different kind of efforts to democratize the working life, and there is a huge problem concerning the inequality of organizing how the work should be organized and so forth. And even Robert A. Dahl, the most prominent American theorist of democracy, argued in the end of his life that this kind of democracy is still in need. And this is something that the social democrats has usually not addressed, because these are very substantive, complicated issues. They are cultural issues, but they are also political issues concerning the working life. In very substantive terms, in very real terms. But the problem with the traditional Marxist approach was that they said that everybody is exploited in every factory in the same way, which doesn't make much sense. But if you take into account the power relations in more concrete terms, the problem is still there.
Sure, but then, you might say democratize working life, and that might work in a closed society or closed economy, or if you do it globally. But we have to work with this globalized capital without any fatherland. And if you democratize, then if that does affect the cost of labor in country A, then capital will withdraw from country A and invest in country B with less democratized labor life. That's the basic, in my view, that's the description of global capitalism that we have to live in.
But you have to remember that also the labor used to be internationally organized. And if you look at the international comparisons at this point, how weak is trade unions, for example, there has been a huge decline since 1975 in terms of the organization rate. But this is not inevitable. It's also about resources, it's also about the targets, it's also about the need is huge because the people who work in China or in Africa in the factories, they really are exploited in real terms.
That's right, but unionization increases fast in China, you know. So let's hope for the better.
Before having the final question, let me remind you of Markus' first question. I mean, how come you forgot the notions of power and interest? I mean, are they relevant at all? Or is it because of your disciplinary backgrounds that you don't recognize these concepts?
Well, we can't talk about everything. Is that reasonable? I don't know. I mean, it's, you know, I'm interested in, I can't talk for Juhana, but I'm interested in questions of principles that might underpin and should promote, or we should be promoting. I mean, I think power and interest are important, but I'm not sure that, you know, in a sense, I mean, if you got a story, I mean, one way you might have some sort of sociological objection that we can't say what we say without acknowledging kind of the, you know, the social origins of certain kinds of ideas or something like that. I mean, do you have an objection to a sociological objection, if you want, to being able to speak about these principles without acknowledging the social background of them or something? Because you might actually think, I mean, one way, sometimes you might actually think that sort of philosophical, I mean, it's nothing to do with economics, but you might actually think that the philosopher's way of talking about this treats ideas as if they exist in some conceptual netherworld, and that I'm not we're not taking seriously enough the sort of contingent features that shape them. Is that what you're saying? Or?
They are not contingent features, but they might be quite systematic, and we have a huge industry of systematic knowledge on these issues concerning welfare structures and this kind of things.
Systematic what?
Systematic industrial research even on welfare. So it's not kind of accidental fact. It's a systematic knowledge.
Sure. In my world, everything should anyway boil down to tax and transfer and social insurance parameters. And then, of course, I'm a fairly conventional economist. So. Yes.
Okay, this is very enjoyable. Very last question.
It's not that answering to your question, Adrian sort of say that we should consider the distribution of things on more broader. So could we just consider that our lifetime expectancy has raised on certain groups and certain groups it hasn't. So wouldn't it be fair for us to work to the longer age and then somehow benefit those who are not members of that group on other ways, for example, taxation ways, or people who are earning less or working many hours but still earning quite little, so paying for them for taxation and still raising the age of.
I mean, just personally, I've always thought, years ago, years ago, I wrote a little bit on this, but I was interested in meaningful work as a distributive good or a distributive benefit. And I do think that there is actually benefit that's often not acknowledged to people like us who work in what you might call meaningful work, I mean, however you define that. And I think that needs to be taken into account when you're looking at the justice of a set of social arrangements. So I think that's in agreement with what you're saying, that a meaningful work is rarely ever thought about as one of the distributive benefits that's allocated within a social system, and I think it should be. So, and that's sort of a part of what was, you know, with, so it's true.
Basically, yes, but then in practical political terms, it's quite hard to design pension systems that incorporate a lot of redistribution. The additional challenge there is that you have to design these policies by using observable, identifiable characteristics of groups of people. For example, if you design a pension system where some people who have according to some group mean, have a lower life expectancy, then of course it would be attractive for whichever person to say, well, I belong to that group. And how will you design the test that discriminates between these different groups? For practical social policy and pension policy, these are extremely difficult issues. But basically, you're right.
Okay, I think it's time to bring this to an end. I want to thank our two speakers very much indeed. This was very, very instructive and enlightening. And my anticipation is that the next step is that Juhana will invite Adrian to his group of advisors.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.